While I was taking off my dress in the bathroom, I heard the camera click. My own daughter's laughter echoed along with her words. "That disgusting belly will make us a fortune, Dad." That's when I discovered that my husband... Well, I'll tell you about that as the story unfolds. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my dears. How wonderful it is to see you all here again. I'm Martha Johnson, 68 years young, born and raised in Oak Ridge, Missouri, back when the town was barely on the map. I still live there to this day. My hands show the marks of time, my hair has gone completely silver, but my heart, oh, this heart still beats full of life. It's such a beautiful day here on my porch. The maple trees are showing their fall colors along the streets, and the sky is the bluest I've ever seen. I have a cup of chamomile tea here with me, made from herbs I grew in my own backyard, and my old recipe notebook that I've been keeping since my 20s. Each page has a story. Each grease stain reminds me of a meal shared with loved ones. You know what I love doing these days? Teaching traditional Midwestern cooking to children at the local elementary school. Every Thursday is Grandma Martha's Kitchen Day. The kids come to learn how to make buttermilk biscuits, apple butter, chicken, and dumplings. These are recipes that are being lost, my dears. Our heartland culture needs to be preserved, don't you think? I started this project 5 years ago when Principal Irene saw me making corn pudding at the church potluck. She came up to me and said, "Mrs. Johnson, you have a gift that shouldn't stay just in your kitchen. Our students need to know these flavors, this history." At first, I was shy. Imagine that, an old lady like me teaching at a school. But when I saw the children's eyes light up as they tasted the cornbread made by their own little hands, I understood that this was my calling. From where I'm sitting, I can see my flower garden. I grow roses that I tend with all my love, an apple tree I planted when I first moved to this house, and even a small vegetable patch with tomatoes, bell peppers, and herbs. It's a blessing to be able to harvest your own food, to feel the soil in your hands. Life has these things, you know? It hurts us, it breaks us, but it also gives us gifts every day if we know how to see them. And you, my dear viewers watching me now, tell me in the comments, which little town are you watching from? And what time of day did you find this video? Early morning with your coffee, after lunch, or already in the evening when the kids are asleep? I always read all the comments, and I'm so happy to know where you're from and when you take a moment from your day to listen to this grandma's stories. Let me know, all right? Let's create a chain of kindness. Today, I want to share with you a story I've kept inside me for many years. It's not easy to talk about, but I believe that sharing it might help others who are going through what I went through. It's about how sometimes the deepest wounds come from the very hands that should protect and love us. It's about betrayal, pain, and most importantly, about rebirth. You know, just because we get older doesn't mean the scars disappear. They're still here, but we learn to live with them, to transform them into strength. My grandmother Gertrude used to say, "A cracked pot can still cook beans. You just need to know how to use the fire." And that's how I learned to deal with my past, adjusting the fire, finding a way to move forward despite the cracks. When I was a girl, back in the 1960s, Oak Ridge was just a handful of houses, dirt roads, and lots of farmland. It was here that I was born, grew up, and saw my life change in ways I could never have imagined. To understand how I got here, I need to go back to when I was just a little girl with pigtails, running through cornfields with my brothers. I grew up in a simple wooden house, with a porch where my mother, Betty, would hang colorful quilts on hot days. My father, August, worked as a carpenter and built every inch of that house with his own hands. The walls were painted light blue. The floor was wooden that my mother swept every day with a broom she made herself. We had a wood stove that sat outside, under a small lean-to, where beans would simmer slowly all day long. There were 5 of us children. I was the middle one. My older brother, John, was already helping Dad with carpentry by the time he was 12. Then came Claudia, who had a special way with plants and knew the name of every wildflower in the county. After me came the twins, Arthur and David, Two little troublemakers who were always up to something, but who defended me tooth and nail when any child bothered me at school. Our routine began early, with the roosters crow from our backyard. Mom would get up first, light the fire, and soon the smell of fresh coffee would fill the house. Dad would leave for work carrying his lunch pail with cornbread and ham. We children would help with chores before going to school, fetching water from the well, feeding the chickens, sweeping the yard. The school was almost an hour's walk away. We'd all go together, barefoot most of the time, carrying notebooks wrapped in brown paper to keep them from getting wet if it rained. Miss Eunice taught all grades together in one room. She was strict, but had a heart as big as the Mississippi. She was the first to notice I had a way with numbers and encouraged me to keep studying. In our free time, our games were simple. We'd fish for catfish in Willow Creek with bamboo poles and hooks that John made. We'd climb trees to pick fruit, apples, peaches, cherries. The girls would play house under the oak tree, using fallen acorns as food. The boys would build wooden cars with spools of thread for wheels. And when it rained, the joy was to run barefoot in the downpour, feeling the wet earth between our toes. We had a neighbor, Mrs. Quinn, who was like a second grandmother to us. A widow, she lived alone in a little pink house and made the best apple butter and pumpkin preserves in the county. On Sunday afternoons, after service at the Little Baptist Chapel, we'd all go to her house to hear ghost stories while eating her wonderful sweets. It was from her that I learned my first kitchen secrets. Oak Ridge, in those days, was a place where everybody knew everybody. The town was still being established. It had been founded just a few years earlier, and the families who arrived came mainly from Kentucky and Tennessee, looking for cheap land to grow corn and raise cattle. We didn't have electricity, just kerosene lamps that we lit when the sun went down. Running water? Not a chance. The luxury was having a well in the yard. Community celebrations were the most anticipated moments. At the 4th of July picnic, the girls would dress up in colorful dresses, and the boys would compete to see who could jump over the highest bonfire. During the county fair, red, white, and blue bunting would decorate the entire town, and the parade would go from house to house with music and singing. Mom would always make a special batch of cornbread and biscuits to welcome the parade goers. It was during one of these celebrations, the county fair, that I first noticed something strange. I must have been about 10 years old. I was square dancing with the other children when I noticed a man looking at me in a different way. It was Mr. Olson, who owned the only general store in town. I felt a bad shiver and ran to my mother. I told her what had happened, but she just said, "Don't fuss about it, girl. Men look, you'll have to get used to it." That stuck in my head. Why did I have to get used to something that made me feel bad? I didn't understand at the time, but it was the first time I realized that being a girl had its complications in this world. As I grew older, I noticed that my mother seemed increasingly tired. Dad, who had always been a hard worker, started coming home late, smelling of whiskey. The arguments became more frequent. One night, I woke up to the sound of something breaking and my mother's screams. I stayed under the covers, trembling, not knowing what to do. The next morning, I saw she had a cut on her lip and a black eye. When I asked what had happened, she said she had fallen down the stairs. There were no stairs in our house. That's when I started to understand that appearances can be deceiving. On the outside, we were a family like any other in Oak Ridge. On the inside, we were beginning to crumble like a termite mound after the rain. John, my older brother, was the first to leave. He couldn't stand seeing what was happening and left to work on the cornfields in Iowa further north. Claudia married at 16 to a boy from Springfield, more to escape home than out of love. That left the three of us, the youngest, at the mercy of our father's increasingly unstable moods. Mom became different too. Once so talkative and full of stories, she now spent her days in silence, cooking and washing clothes like a ghost of her former self. Sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, I would catch her crying softly while stirring the beans on the stove. At school, Miss Eunice noticed that something wasn't right with me. One day, she called me after class. "Martha," she said, holding my hands, "a smart girl like you needs to study more. There's a better school in Kansas City. My sister works there and can take you in." I was torn between the hope of a better life and the fear of leaving my brothers behind. It was during this time that my father lost his job at the sawmill. He began spending entire days sitting on the porch, drinking and grumbling about how life had been unfair to him. When we tried to talk to him, he'd tell us to shut up with harsh words I'll never forget. "Useless mouths to feed," he would say, looking at us children. One night, after a drinking binge worse than the others, he came home shouting that he was going to end it all. He grabbed a hunting knife and began breaking the few pieces of furniture we had. Mom told us to run to Mrs. Quinn's house. We spent the night there, hearing from a distance the sound of the destruction of our house and our childhood. The next morning, when we returned, half of our belongings had been destroyed. Mom had a cut on her arm that she tried to hide with a cloth. That's when I decided I needed to leave, not just for myself, but to somehow help my family. At the age of 12, I packed my small bundle of clothes and, with my mother's tearful blessing, left for Kansas City to live with Miss Eunice's sister. The last glance I cast back was at my twin brothers, holding hands, waving from the door of our broken house. I promised myself that one day I would return for them. The house of Miss Zoe, Miss Eunice's sister, was in a simple neighborhood of Kansas City called Westport. It was a small building, but made of brick, with a cement floor and a backyard where she raised chickens and grew a garden. A single woman, a teacher like her sister, she received me with a mixture of affection and firmness. "Here you will study and help around the house. No slacking off," were her first words to me. And so it was. At 13, I woke up at 5 in the morning, helped prepare breakfast, swept the yard, and went to school. In the afternoon, I tended the garden, washed clothes, and did my homework. Miss Zoe was demanding but fair. For the first time, I had new notebooks, shoes that weren't hand-me-downs, and 3 guaranteed meals every day. At Lincoln High School, I discovered a different world. The big city scared and fascinated me at the same time. There was electricity, cars, cement sidewalks. The girls in my class wore colorful ribbons in their hair and talked about things I barely knew. Radio, cinema, birthday parties with frosted cake. I felt like a country sparrow lost in the city. Gradually, I adapted. I began to excel in math and English classes. Miss Zoe noticed my effort and gifted me with used books she bought at the secondhand bookstore. I read everything that fell into my hands: novels, poetry, history books. At night, before sleeping, I would write letters to my mother and my little brothers, telling them about my new life. I rarely received a response, but when I did, it was a piece of joy that I kept under my pillow. At 16, I got a part-time job at a grocery store. Half of my salary went to Miss Zoe, who carefully saved it for my future education. The other half I sent to my mother in Oak Ridge. It was while working at the grocery store that I met Dorothea, a lady who sold baked goods. She taught me to make cookies, cakes, and sweets that I sold at the school gate on Sundays to earn extra money. At the turn of my 18th year, I received news that broke my heart. My father had died, a victim of cirrhosis. I returned to Oak Ridge for the first time in 6 years for the funeral. The town had grown, but our old house remained the same, perhaps more dilapidated. My mother seemed to have aged 20 years. The twins, now 15-year-old teenagers, barely recognized me. After the funeral, I sat with my mother on the porch. Through tears, she told me that despite the violence, she would miss her husband. "You get used to even pain, my daughter," she said, passing her calloused hands over her time-marked face. That's when I realized that the twins needed a chance like the one I had. I promised my mother that, as soon as I was better established, I would bring the boys to study in Kansas City. Back in Kansas City, I intensified my studies. With Miss Zoe's support, I managed to enter the accounting course at the technical college. It was there that I met Richard. Tall, with green eyes and an easy smile, he was the son of a city merchant. Intelligent and ambitious, he spoke of his plans to open his own business, to travel the world. Next to my simpler classmates, Richard seemed to come from another universe. To my surprise, he was the one who approached first. He started by asking for help with financial math exercises, a subject in which I excelled. Soon we were spending breaks together, talking about books and dreams. When he invited me for ice cream after class, I felt my legs tremble with nervousness. Me, the barefoot girl from Oak Ridge, going out with the most coveted boy in the class. Richard was kind and attentive. He listened to my stories about childhood in the countryside with an interest that made me feel special. "You're different from the other girls, Martha," he would say. "You have depth, you have roots." Gradually, I lowered my guard, allowing myself to be enveloped by that affection I had never experienced before. Our courtship progressed quickly. At 20, when I graduated from the technical course, Richard asked me to marry him. Miss Zoe was suspicious. She thought I was too young and that we should wait for him to finish his business administration degree. "A man in a hurry to marry has a reason," she warned me. But I was in love and determined. We married in a simple ceremony at the First Baptist Church in Kansas City. My mother and the twins came for the celebration. Richard rented a small house for us in the River Market neighborhood, not far from the construction materials store where he started working with his father. I got a job at Mr. Abbott's accounting office, where I put into practice what I had learned in the technical course. The first months were like a dream. We set up our house with simple furniture, cooked together, made plans. Richard talked about buying a plot of land, building a bigger house, having children. I continued sending money to my mother and saving to bring the twins, who were now 17 years old. That's when I began to notice the first changes in Richard. Small at first, impatience when dinner wasn't ready, an acid comment about my clothes, a complaint about the money I sent to my family. "Now we are your family, Martha," he would say when I mentioned my promise to bring the twins. One day, I came home from work and found Richard at home, earlier than normal. He was sitting in the living room, leafing through my recipe notebook, the same one I carry with me to this day. "What's this?" he asked, showing an envelope kept between the pages. It was the money I was secretly saving to help my brothers. "Are you hiding money from me?" he asked, his voice low, but sharp as a well-honed kitchen knife. I tried to explain, to say it was a promise I had made to my mother, but he didn't want to listen. "You're lying to your husband. Is that what your mother taught you?" That night, Richard didn't raise a hand to me. He didn't need to. His words were enough to make me feel small, insignificant, ungrateful. He left, slamming the door, and only returned the next morning, smelling of alcohol. He apologized, hugged me, said he had reacted badly because he was concerned about our future. Us against the world, remember? A few months later, I discovered I was pregnant. Richard was radiant. He stopped drinking, became attentive again, started making plans for the baby. We bought a second-hand crib and painted it white. We didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl, but I secretly wished for a girl. Julia was born on a hot January morning in 1982. Beautiful, with her father's green eyes and my dark hair. When I placed her in Richard's arms for the first time, I saw tears in his eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered. "We'll give her everything the world has to offer." For a time, we lived in relative harmony. Richard was promoted at the store. I stopped working to take care of Julia. The twins ended up following their own paths. Arthur joined the army, and David got a job on a farm in the northern part of the state. My mother passed away quietly in her sleep when Julia was 2 years old. I couldn't even attend the funeral, as the girl was sick. As Julia grew, Richard became increasingly controlling, but in a subtle way that at the time I confused with care and love. He chose the clothes I should wear, decided who we could socialize with, controlled every penny that came in and went out. "I'm taking care of you," he would say. "The world out there is dangerous." When Julia turned 7, Richard got the money to open his own electrical supply store. The business did well from the start. We moved to a bigger house in a better neighborhood. Julia entered a private school. For the first time, we had some comfort. That's when Richard began to distance himself. He spent more and more time at the store, always with his phone in hand, speaking softly when I approached. "It's work, Martha. You wouldn't understand," he would say when I asked. "Someone needs to ensure the comfort of this house." It was during this time that I also noticed changes in Julia. The sweet and affectionate girl gave way to a distant and critical preteen. I began to notice her looks of disapproval, her comments about my way of speaking, of dressing, of cooking. "Mom, that dress is so country," she would say. Or, "Why don't you speak properly like my friends' mothers?" Each criticism was like a small needle in my heart. I tried to talk to Richard about the girl's behavior, but he minimized it. "It's a phase, Martha. All girls go through this." Sometimes I even caught a little smile at the corner of his mouth when Julia made a particularly cruel comment about me. One day, when Julia was 12, she entered the bathroom while I was showering. Instinctively, I tried to cover myself. I had always been reserved, never felt comfortable showing my body. "Gross, Mom," she exclaimed with a disgusted expression. "Your body is so ugly. Look at those stretch marks, that sagging belly. No wonder Dad comes home late." I was paralyzed, the water running down my body, her words running down my soul. I didn't know what to answer. I just asked, with a trembling voice, for her to leave and let me finish my shower in peace. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, remembering the girl I had been in Oak Ridge, full of dreams and wondering where I had gone wrong. What I didn't know was that that episode in the bathroom was just the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. A nightmare I could never have imagined, plotted by the two people I loved most in the world. After that day in the bathroom, something definitely changed in our house. It was as if a floodgate had been opened and there was no going back. Julia's criticisms became part of our daily routine. Nothing I did was good enough. The coffee was weak, the clothes weren't ironed well, the house wasn't clean enough. "Mom, are you really going out with your hair like that? Looks like a tornado went through your head." Or, "This food tastes like dirt. Other mothers know how to cook properly." And even, "Why do you talk that way? It's embarrassing when my friends come over." Each word was like a small stab. The worst part was that Richard, instead of defending me or guiding our daughter, seemed to find amusement in the situations. Sometimes, I caught him observing these interactions with a strange smile at the corner of his mouth, almost satisfied. When I tried to talk to him about Julia's behavior, the answer was always the same. "You're exaggerating, Martha. She's just growing up, discovering who she is. All teenagers are like that." And he would add, "Maybe you should try harder to update yourself, improve a bit." So I became increasingly insecure and isolated. The few friends I had in Kansas City drifted away. Richard always found flaws in them, said they were opportunistic or bad influences. My contacts with my brothers were reduced to quick phone calls on commemorative dates. Life continued to appear normal to those looking from the outside. Richard prospered in business. Julia attended one of the best schools in the city, had ballet classes, English lessons, swimming. We lived in a nice house in the Brookside neighborhood with 3 bedrooms, a yard, and even a small pool. But within those walls, I felt increasingly like a stranger, a servant in my own home. It was when Julia entered adolescence that things significantly worsened. At 14, she was already a beautiful young woman, with her father's features and my height. She had a group of friends from school, girls from wealthy families who occasionally visited her. I noticed that when these girls were at home, Julia's behavior towards me became even crueler, as if she wanted to humiliate me in front of them. One afternoon, I returned earlier than expected from the supermarket and found Julia and her friends in the living room. When I entered carrying heavy bags, Julia looked at me with disdain and said, "Look, girls, this is what happens when you don't study and end up being just a housewife. Take it as a lesson." The girls laughed, and I felt my cheeks burn with shame. I lowered my head and went straight to the kitchen, tears blurring my vision as I put away the groceries. On another occasion, I was ironing clothes while Julia was talking to Richard in the living room. "Dad," she said, loud enough for me to hear, "why did you marry Mom? She's so simple. You could have chosen someone better." The silence that followed the question hurt more than any answer. Richard didn't defend me, he simply changed the subject. The most difficult moments, however, continued to be those related to my body. Julia seemed to have a fixation on pointing out my physical imperfections, especially when I was most vulnerable. She began entering the bathroom while I was changing or showering with a disturbing frequency. "Look at these cellulites, Mom. It's disgusting. Your belly looks like a poorly kneaded bread dough. These stretch marks are repulsive. How does Dad stand looking at this?" When I asked for privacy or tried to lock the door, she would complain to her father, who invariably took her side. "What secret do you have to hide, Martha? She's your daughter, for God's sake. Stop creating drama." There was something strange about this insistence, something I couldn't fully understand. Why did my daughter seem so obsessed with seeing me naked, with pointing out every imperfection in my body? Why did my husband, who had barely touched me for years, encourage this behavior? One day, I noticed that some of my underwear had disappeared from the drawer. When I asked Julia and Richard if they had seen it, they both looked at me as if I were crazy. "You're getting paranoid, Martha," said Richard. "You probably threw them away and don't remember." But I was sure I hadn't thrown anything away, just as I was sure that someone was going through my things when I wasn't home. I began to notice other disturbing details. Sometimes, upon entering a room, I had the feeling that Richard and Julia had just interrupted a conversation. They exchanged complicit looks, as if sharing a secret from which I was excluded. Richard, always busy with the store, began appearing at home at unexpected times. When I asked why, he gave vague answers. "Just came to get some documents," or "needed to check something with Julia about school." Technology has always been a mystery to me. I grew up in an era without computers, and although we had one at home now, I rarely used it. Richard and Julia were the tech experts of the family, always with their pagers, digital cameras, and computers. When I approached while they were using these devices, they quickly changed screens or turned off the devices. "This is work stuff, Martha. You wouldn't understand," Richard would say when I showed curiosity. "It's school stuff, Mom. Too complicated for you," was Julia's response. There was a particularly painful occasion when, while serving dinner, I spilled some sauce on the tablecloth. Before I could clean it up, Julia was already standing, filming with the digital camera. "What are you doing?" I asked, confused. "Documenting your incompetence," she responded with a malicious smile. "You're a disaster even at serving food." Richard, instead of intervening, seemed satisfied. "Leave her be, Martha. It's just a joke." But it didn't seem like a joke. The look they exchanged at that moment had something calculating about it, as if they were executing a plan. My self-esteem, already fragile, plummeted completely. I began to look in the mirror and could only see what they pointed out: the ugly, clumsy, ignorant, unworthy woman. I developed the habit of dressing and undressing in the dark, of showering only when I was sure Julia was out, of speaking as little as possible to avoid being corrected. At night, lying next to Richard, who for years had slept with his back to me, I would cry silently, remembering the girl I once was in Oak Ridge, the dreams I had, the life I had imagined for myself. How had I reached this point? How could my own husband and my daughter treat me this way? I tried to seek help. Once I gathered courage and called a former colleague from the accounting office. I told her, in half words, about how I felt diminished at home. She suggested that I seek therapy, that I might be depressed. When I mentioned this to Richard, he laughed. "Therapy? With what money? Do you think money falls from the sky? Besides, the problem isn't psychological, Martha. The problem is that you don't try hard enough." I also tried to get closer to Julia in other ways. I started learning new recipes, buying hidden cooking magazines to surprise her with different dishes. "This has too many carbs. I'll get fat like you," was her response when I prepared a special lasagna for her 15th birthday. One day, while cleaning Julia's room, one of my many daily duties, I found a notebook hidden under the mattress. I know I shouldn't have, but I opened it. What I found left me cold. They were notes, like a diary, but not a normal teenager's diary. There were lists titled "Ways to Humiliate Mom" and "Things to Say About Her Body." Some entries had observations like, "Dad liked this one," or "Film next time." I was paralyzed, the notebook trembling in my hands. This wasn't normal teenage behavior. These weren't just spontaneous, malicious comments. It was something planned, systematic, almost rehearsed. When I heard the front door opening, I quickly put the notebook back in its hiding place. It was Richard, coming home in the middle of the afternoon, once again at an unexpected time. He found me still in Julia's room, pale and trembling. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his tone immediately suspicious. "Just tidying up her room," I answered, trying to control my voice. "Did you go through her things?" His gaze was penetrating, almost threatening. "No, of course not. I just changed the bedsheets and dusted." He observed me for a long moment, as if assessing whether I was lying. "Finish this quickly and go prepare dinner. Julia has a test tomorrow and needs a decent meal to study." That night, I couldn't sleep. The discovery of the notebook spun in my mind. What was happening in my own home? Why did my daughter keep a list of ways to humiliate me? And why did my husband seem to be involved in this? I didn't know yet, but I was about to discover the most terrible truth of all, a truth that would change my life forever. The discovery of that notebook changed something inside me. For days I observed Richard and Julia with different eyes, noticing the whispers, the complicit looks, the messages they exchanged on the phone. There was a plan in progress, and I was at the center of it, but I still didn't fully understand what or why. One night, Richard announced that he would need to travel to Springfield for an electrical materials fair. He would be gone for 2 days. "Will you be okay alone with Julia?" he asked, as if I were the teenager and not the mother. I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief for his absence and apprehension about being alone with my daughter, who seemed to despise me more and more. The day after Richard's departure, Julia left early for school and would then go directly to a friend's house, where she would spend the afternoon studying for tests. For the first time in weeks, I would have the house to myself for a few hours. A strange feeling of freedom, even within my own home. I took advantage of it to do a deeper cleaning, something that had calmed me since the days I lived with Miss Zoe. While cleaning Richard's office, a room I rarely entered, as he always said he didn't want anyone touching his papers, I noticed that the computer was on. He had probably forgotten to turn it off in the rush to leave for the trip. I stopped, broom in hand, looking at the screen in sleep mode. I had never been one to snoop through Richard's things. I respected his space, his rules, but after finding Julia's notebook, after years of feeling something was wrong, a force greater than my hesitation pushed me to the chair in front of the computer. When I moved the mouse, the screen lit up. There was no password. Richard probably never imagined I would have the courage to use his computer. On the screen, an open window showed a folder full of files with dates. I clicked on one of them, dated 3 weeks ago. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. It was a video of me, in the bathroom, naked. The camera was positioned at an angle I would never suspect, capturing every movement as I undressed to enter the shower. The quality was good, almost professional. And then Julia's voice off camera. "Look at that fat, she looks like a pig." My face in the video contracted with pain, but I continued undressing, not realizing I was being filmed. My fingers trembled so much I could barely click to close the video. But there were dozens of similar files, all with different dates, covering years. With my heart in my throat, I opened another file, this time from a different folder called Specials. It was another video of me, but this time I was cooking. The camera seemed to be hidden somewhere in the kitchen. Julia entered the frame and began making comments about my appearance, my way of speaking, my incompetence. With each insult, I shrank a little more, like a wounded animal. The video had a quality of editing, with cuts and different angles, as if someone had worked on it afterward. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but at the same time, everything began to make sense. Julia's constant intrusions in the bathroom, the cell phone always at hand to film me in vulnerable moments, Richard arriving home at unexpected times, the whispers, the looks. With my hands still trembling, I clicked on another folder titled Business. Inside, I found emails. Dozens of them, exchanged between Richard and people with strange usernames. The emails talked about values, transfers, new material, better angles. One email in particular caught my attention. Dated just 2 days ago from someone called VIP Client 22. Richard, the last video in the mother humiliation series was excellent. Her reaction when the girl criticized her body in the shower is worth every penny. My users are asking for more similar material. If you can capture more authentic crying reactions, the value increases. Transfer made as agreed. Keep up the good work. I read and reread that message, trying to process what it meant. Gradually, the terrible truth took shape in my mind. Richard and Julia weren't just humiliating me out of gratuitous cruelty. They were filming me, editing the videos, and selling them. Selling my humiliation, my pain, my naked and aging body exposed against my will. They were profiting from my suffering. The tears came, hot and abundant, running down my face and falling onto the keyboard. I almost vomited right there, in front of that screen that revealed the monstrosity that was happening under my own roof, perpetrated by the man with whom I had shared my life for more than 2 decades and by the girl I had carried in my womb. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed, crying. When I finally managed to move, a thought took hold of me. I needed evidence. If I confronted Richard with just what I had seen, he would deny everything, say I was crazy, making things up, as he had done so many times. With a flash drive I found in the desk drawer, I began copying all the files I could. Videos, emails, transfer receipts. Each click was a stab in my heart, especially when I needed to see the thumbnails of videos where I appeared in humiliating or intimate situations. But I continued, driven by something stronger than pain, perhaps anger, perhaps survival instinct. As the files were being copied, an old memory came to my mind. My mother, on the porch of our house in Oak Ridge, saying, "You get used to even pain, my daughter." I had gotten so used to daily abuse that I stopped recognizing it as such. I accepted as normal something that was far, very far from being acceptable. A noise at the front door made me jump from the chair. Quickly, I turned off the monitor, without shutting down the computer so as not to interrupt the copying of files, put the flash drive in my apron pocket, and left the office, closing the door. I picked up the broom I had left leaning against the wall and pretended to be cleaning the hallway. It was Julia, returning earlier than expected. When she saw me, her look was one of contempt, as always. "What are you doing near Dad's office?" she asked, immediately suspicious. "Just cleaning, honey," I replied, trying to control the tremor in my voice, avoiding looking directly at her. How could I face my own daughter after what I had discovered? How would I continue living under the same roof as them, knowing what they were doing? "Did you go in there?" Her eyes narrowed, accusatory. "No, of course not. Your father doesn't like me touching his things. You know that." The lie came more easily than I expected. Perhaps because, for the first time in years, I was fighting for myself. Julia seemed satisfied with the answer, or at least pretended to believe it. "I'm going to take a shower. Don't bother me," she said, going to her room. As soon as she entered the bathroom and I heard the shower turn on, I quickly returned to the office. The file copying had finished. I properly shut down the computer, put the flash drive inside my bra, and left, making sure to leave everything exactly as it was before. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying in the bed I shared with Richard, looking at the ceiling, I felt something break definitively inside me. It wasn't just my heart, it was an entire life built on lies, an entire future I had imagined for my family. The next morning dawned with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. As I prepared breakfast for Julia, as I did every day, my mind was working on a plan. I couldn't confront them directly. It would be dangerous, and they would certainly destroy the evidence. I needed to be cautious, methodical, as they had been in slowly destroying me over the years. "Mom, this juice is sour," complained Julia, pushing the glass away. "You really can't do anything right." I looked at her, my daughter, my blood, and felt a mixture of pain, disappointment, and surprisingly, pity. What had we become? What had Richard done to both of us? "I'm sorry, honey." "I'll make another one," I replied meekly, maintaining the same submissive posture as always. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. The broken and insecure woman was beginning to awaken, to rebuild herself. As Julia finished breakfast and left for school without even saying goodbye, I already knew what I needed to do. I would not remain one more day in that house of horrors. I would no longer be the target of that sick scheme. I would not allow them to continue profiting from my humiliation. With the flash drive secure against my chest, I packed a small suitcase, taking only the essentials, some clothes, personal documents, the recipe notebook that had accompanied me since my youth, and an old photo of my mother. I left everything ready, hidden under the bed. Richard would return at the end of the day. He would never suspect that his submissive wife, his perfect victim, would have the courage to retaliate. That would be their biggest mistake, underestimating me, believing they had completely destroyed my spirit. I looked one last time at the house that had been my prison for so many years. In a few hours, I would begin a new life, a life of dignity, of justice. The girl from Oak Ridge, who had faced so many difficulties, was rising from the ashes, and this time she would not be silenced. When the clock struck 10 in the morning, I took my small hidden suitcase and left the house. I didn't leave a note, didn't lock the door. I wanted it to seem like I had just gone out to shop, like any normal day. The flash drive was secure in my purse, along with my documents. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat, but my steps were firm, determined. My first instinct was to seek out Miss Zoe, the woman who had taken me in when I arrived in Kansas City decades ago. But she had passed away a few years back, and I didn't have many friends. Richard had made sure of that over the years, systematically isolating me. I needed to be careful. If I went to the home of someone he knew, it would be the first place Richard would look for me when he noticed my absence. I took a bus to downtown. Sitting near the window, watching Kansas City pass before my eyes, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. Where would I go? What would I do? For the first time in decades, I was completely alone, without a guaranteed roof over my head. But also, for the first time in a long time, I was free. At the bus terminal, I bought a ticket to Independence, a neighboring city to Kansas City. I didn't want to go too far yet. I needed to resolve the situation with Richard and Julia before any long-term plans. In Independence, I looked for a small inn called Traveler's Rest, run by an elderly couple, Mr. Oliver and Mrs. Daisy. I paid 2 days in advance, with part of the money I had secretly saved over the years, hiding a few coins here and there from the change from groceries. The room was simple, a twin bed, a small wardrobe, a clean but basic bathroom. To me, it seemed like a palace. I sat on the bed, looking through the window that faced a quiet street, and for the first time in a long time, I cried freely, without fear of being ridiculed or filmed. I cried for the young woman I once was, for the mother I tried to be, for the life I had dreamed of. When the tears dried, I washed my face with cold water and looked in the mirror. I saw the swollen eyes, the wrinkles around them, the hair beginning to show gray strands. But I also saw something I hadn't seen in a long time: dignity, courage. I opened my purse and took out the flash drive. I sat at the small desk in the room and connected it to my cell phone using an adapter I had bought years ago and almost never used. I needed to verify what I had managed to copy, organize the evidence. What I saw again filled me with nausea and horror. Dozens of videos of me in intimate situations or being humiliated, emails negotiating values, bank transfers. There was enough material there to incriminate Richard for years. As I organized the files, I noticed something I hadn't realized in the rush to copy everything. Some of the transfers came from accounts abroad. What Richard was doing wasn't just a violation of my privacy and dignity. It was a sophisticated scheme, probably illegal on various levels. This explained the miraculous growth of his business in recent years, the money for the new house, for Julia's expensive school, for the luxuries he insisted he achieved with hard work. That night, I couldn't sleep properly, haunted by nightmares where Richard and Julia chased me, laughing at my attempts to escape. I woke before dawn, sweaty and trembling. But the daylight brought clarity. I knew what I needed to do. After a simple breakfast served by Mrs. Daisy, who looked at me with gentle eyes, asking if I was okay, I left the inn with a purpose. I took a bus back to Kansas City and got off downtown, near the courthouse. I had never entered there, but I knew it was where the justice organs were located. Asking a few people, I was directed to the specialized police station for the defense of women, which was a few blocks from there. The building was more welcoming than I had imagined, with posters about women's rights on the walls. At the reception, a young policewoman attended to me. I swallowed the lump in my throat and said, "I need to file a complaint about my husband and my daughter." The policewoman, whom I later found out was named Tanya, took me to a private room where I could tell my story. It was difficult to find the right words, to explain what had happened without going into explicit details. The shame still consumed me, even knowing that I was the victim, not the guilty one. "Mrs. Johnson, what you're describing constitutes several crimes," said Tanya, after hearing my initial account. "We need to register a police report, and you will have to testify formally. May I call the detective for us to talk better?" I nodded, my hands trembling as I held my purse against my chest, as if it were a shield. Minutes later, Detective Irene Flowers entered the room. She was a middle-aged woman with firm but gentle eyes who emanated a quiet authority. "Mrs. Johnson, Officer Tanya briefly reported your situation to me. I want you to know that you are in a safe place now, and we will do everything necessary to protect you and hold the culprits accountable." "You said you have evidence?" I showed the flash drive, explaining how I had managed to copy the files. The detective called an IT technician who transferred all the content to the police station's computers. Meanwhile, I gave my formal testimony, describing years of psychological abuse, the discovery of the videos, the sales scheme. "Based on what we're seeing here, your husband can be indicted for several crimes: violation of privacy, production and distribution of intimate content without consent, psychological violence, and possibly even international trafficking, depending on who these foreign buyers are," explained the detective. "As for your daughter, she is a minor, correct?" "Yes, she's 16 years old," I replied, feeling a pain in my chest, thinking about Julia being taken by the police. "In that case, she will be treated as a juvenile offender. She will be referred to the juvenile court. But before anything, we need to ensure your safety. Does Mr. Richard know that you left home?" I explained that I had left as if I were going shopping, and that he would return from his trip that afternoon. He would probably only notice my absence at night. "Perfect. So we have time to act. I'll request protective measures immediately, and we'll organize an operation to catch him in the act if possible. The cybercrime team is already analyzing the material, and will need a warrant to seize the equipment in your house." The following hours were a whirlwind. I signed papers, answered more questions, drank bitter coffee from plastic cups. The detective offered to refer me to a shelter, but I preferred to return to the inn in Independence. I wanted to maintain some independence, some control over my own life. In that case, do not return home under any circumstances, at least until we arrest your husband, warned the detective. And keep your cell phone always nearby. I'll program an emergency number for quick dialing, in case he tries to contact or find you. I returned to the inn feeling strangely light, as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. There was a long road ahead, but I had taken the first step. For the first time in decades, I was confronting the abuse instead of silently accepting it. The next morning, I received a call from Detective Irene. Her voice conveyed contained satisfaction. "Mrs. Johnson, I wanted to inform you that we obtained the warrant and conducted the operation last night. Your husband was caught in the act while accessing and trying to delete the files you showed us. We seized all computers, cell phones, and storage media from the house. As for your daughter, she was apprehended and referred to the Juvenile Detention Center, where she will remain until the hearing." I collapsed on the bed, trembling. It was real. It had happened. Richard was in jail. Julia was in custody. The tears came again, but they weren't just tears of pain. There was relief in them, and also grief for the family I thought I had, and that never really existed. "What now?" I asked. My voice choked. "Now the judicial process begins. You will need to appear at some hearings, but don't worry, we will provide psychological support and free legal assistance. As for returning to your house?" "I don't want to go back to that house," I interrupted, surprising myself with my own firmness. "There are too many bad memories." "I understand. But legally, the house is a marital asset, and you have a right to your share. I suggest you seek the public defender's office for guidance on the division of assets and divorce." In the days that followed, I was guided by the social assistants of the police station and referred to a support group for women victims of violence. There, I met other women who, like me, had found the strength to break cycles of abuse. Among them was Ivy, a retired social worker who would become a precious friend in the months that followed. It was Ivy who helped me find a place to stay after I left the inn, a small rented room in her house in Independence. It was also she who encouraged me to seek therapy and to resume my accounting skills to look for a job. The judicial process was long and painful. Richard was sentenced to 8 years in prison for various crimes, including production and distribution of intimate material without consent, psychological violence, and association with international trafficking of improper content. As for Julia, the most painful part of it all, she remained under state custody for 6 months, receiving intensive psychological counseling. The reports indicated that she had been manipulated by Richard from an early age, developing pathological behavior towards me. I never returned to that house in Brookside. With the guidance of the public defender's office, I got my share from the sale of the property and other assets. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start over. And it was thinking about this fresh start that I made the decision that would once again change the course of my life, to return to Oak Ridge, my homeland. Returning to Oak Ridge was like closing a circle. When I stepped again on that red earth, almost 40 years after having left as a frightened girl, I felt that I was finally coming home. The town, of course, was no longer that handful of houses from my childhood. It had grown, developed with buildings, asphalt, commerce. But the sky remained equally blue. The air had the same smell of farmland, and the people maintained that welcoming way of the Missouri countryside. With the money from my share of the sale of the house and assets in Kansas City, I bought a simple but comfortable little house in the Maple Creek neighborhood, with 2 bedrooms, a cozy living room, spacious kitchen, and a backyard where I soon began to plant a bit of everything: basil, rosemary, peppers, tomatoes, as well as the flowers I always loved. Each planted seedling was like an affirmation: I am putting down roots again. I am rebuilding my life. At 58, it wasn't easy to start over. For a while, I lived off my savings while trying to reconnect with the town and with myself. The therapy, which I continued doing by phone with the psychologist I had met in Kansas City, was fundamental in this process. Gradually, I learned to look in the mirror without hearing the critical voices from the past, to value my skills, to forgive myself for having allowed the abuse for so long. It was during this healing period that I rediscovered my love for cooking. No longer as an obligation or source of criticism, but as a pleasure, a form of expression. I began to recover the old recipes I had learned from my mother, from Mrs. Quinn, from Dorothea, from the grocery store. I experimented with new combinations, adapted traditional dishes, invited neighbors to taste my creations. My neighbor, Nancy, a retired teacher, was the first to suggest that I make this more than a hobby. "Martha, these apple fritters are the best I've ever eaten. You should sell at the farmer's market." At first, I resisted the idea. I still felt insecure about exposing myself like that. But Nancy insisted until, one Saturday in October, there I was with a small table at the market, selling apple fritters, cornbread, and cheese biscuits. To my surprise, everything was gone before noon. The following week, I needed to make twice as much, and even that wasn't enough. My treats gained fame in the town, and soon I had orders for parties, meetings, even for the city hall when they received visitors from out of town. It was as if each recipe carried a bit of my story, of my resistance, of my rebirth. Today, at 68, I maintain a peaceful and rewarding routine here in Oak Ridge. I wake up early, with the birds singing in the backyard. I have my coffee on the porch, observing the roses I cultivate with care. On Mondays and Wednesdays, I still sell at the farmer's market, but now I have help from Mary, a young single mother who has become almost a daughter to me. On Thursdays, as I mentioned, I go to the elementary school to teach traditional cooking to the children, a project that started 5 years ago and has become one of the great joys of my life. My house is always open. Nancy drops by almost daily for coffee. Mr. John, not my brother, but a gentleman who has the same name as him, comes by in the afternoons for a game of dominoes on the porch. The young people in the neighborhood affectionately call me Grandma Martha and always show up to try some new recipe. As for my biological family, I maintained contact with my twin brothers, Arthur and David. Arthur retired from the Army and now lives in Des Moines with his wife. David remained in the northern part of the state, has 3 children and 5 grandchildren who visit me occasionally. These are sweet moments when we are all together, as if we had finally found the peace that was denied to us in childhood. And Julia? That's the question many ask me, with lowered eyes, hesitant voices. My daughter served the period determined by the justice system in the juvenile detention center, and then went to live with a paternal aunt in Chicago. In the first years, we had no contact. The psychologist recommended distance so that she could receive proper treatment. When she turned 18, I received a letter from her, a long, painful letter asking for forgiveness, explaining how she had been manipulated by her father from a young age, how he had distorted her perception of me, of relationships, of love. I responded with kindness, but also with honesty. I said that I forgave her, that I understood how she too had been a victim, but that we needed time, space, healing. Today, we have a distant but cordial relationship. She lives in Evanston, is a university professor, married, without children. We talk a few times a year, by phone. Maybe one day the wound will heal completely, maybe not. I've learned that some reconciliations happen slowly, over decades, and others remain incomplete, and that's okay. What matters is that I found peace. In my little house in Oak Ridge, surrounded by my flowering garden, by people who truly love me, by children who call me Grandma even without blood ties, I feel that I am finally living the life I always deserved. It's not a life of luxuries or grand events, but it's full of small, authentic joys, of dignity, of purpose. Sometimes, when I'm teaching a girl to knead bread dough, or when I see an especially beautiful sunset tinting the Oak Ridge sky, I think of the long journey that brought me here. Of the pains, the struggles, but also of the hands that extended to help me in the most difficult moments. And I feel gratitude for the strength I discovered in myself, for the chance to start over, for the opportunity to transform my story of pain into a message of hope for others. My dear friends, I come to the end of this conversation with a light heart for having shared such an intimate piece of my journey. You know, when I look back, I see that my story is not just about pain. It's about rediscovery, about finding strength in places I didn't even know existed within me. For you, women who carry invisible scars in your hearts, I want to say, your traumas do not define who you are. They are merely chapters of a much larger story, a story that is still being written by your own hands. For a long time, I believed I needed a savior, someone who would come from outside to rescue my dignity. But I discovered that within us exists a silent strength, dormant perhaps, just waiting for the right moment to awaken. Reconstruction doesn't happen overnight. It's like a gentle rain on the countryside. It seems insignificant, but it nourishes the earth little by little, until one day you notice that flowers have sprouted where before there was only cracked earth. Each small act of courage, be it looking in the mirror and smiling at yourself or saying no when before you would say yes out of fear, is a drop of that renewing rain. I learned that my wrinkled hands are capable not only of making a perfect pie, but also of rebuilding an entire life. Age has given me a wisdom that many mistake for weakness, but it's just the opposite. There is a silent power in us, mature women, who have weathered storms and still maintain the ability to cultivate gardens. I discovered that my voice, even when trembling, has power when I decide to use it. And I'm not talking about shouts or speeches, but that inner voice that says, you deserve peace, you deserve respect, you deserve joy. Hearing that voice, believing in it, was the first step of my healing journey. Time doesn't erase all marks, but it teaches us to transform them into something meaningful. My wrinkles are maps of the difficult paths I've traveled, and today I carry them with pride. Each line tells a story of silent resistance, of small daily victories. And if there's one thing I've discovered, it's that it's never too late to bloom. At 58, when many think about retreating, I was just beginning my true life. Today, at 68, I feel that I still have much to discover, to create, to share. For those still walking through the darkness of trauma, know that there is light at the end of this journey. Not the light of an external savior, but that which you yourself light, step by step, day by day. Trust your time, your process. Healing is not linear. There are days of advance and days of retreat, and all of them are necessary parts of the journey. My dear viewers who have watched me this far, I ask from my heart, please subscribe to this channel now and hit the notification bell. Each subscription is like an extended hand to other women who need to hear that it's possible to start over, no matter the age, no matter the trauma. Share this video immediately with some woman you know who needs strength to take the first step. A shared story can be the first ray of light in dark days. Leave in the comments the word rebirth if you watched this far and believe that every woman deserves the chance to rewrite her story. Do it now. Don't wait another minute. Your action can be the turning point in the life of someone who is suffering in silence, as I suffered for so many years. And always remember, when we plant seeds of hope in other people's hearts, our own garden blooms even more beautifully.